Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Access Blockbusters Pod. It is episode number 41. Thank you guys so much for joining us as we are here to discuss a lot of really fun television that we got this week. I am just so excited because what a time it is to be a fan of these properties. Lord of the Rings, Marvel, DC, it's just an awesome time. And really excited because it's been a little bit of a slower week in terms of news, and so not as much breaking news to discuss here or new trailers or anything like that. Although, did you guys see the trailer for Mickey 17? Crazy looking trailer. I mean, I think that Bong Joon-ho is what a crazy trailer that was. So maybe someday we'll talk about that movie when it comes out in January. But in the meantime, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Access Blockbusters Pod episode 41. If this is your first time on the channel, thank you so much. Please make sure to subscribe, give this video a like if you are on the YouTube channel listening to the podcast. And if you are listening on Spotify, then please give the show a rating. Let me know what you think about the show as well. Guys, there's a lot to talk about here. I know it's not as many topics, quote unquote, as we usually do, but there is just so much to dive into here, and I'm just so excited to do it. So without further ado, let's dive in to all the things that we are going to be talking about today. Okay, so let's start out here with a little bit of speculation, right? I think it's been a little bit of a slower week for news as I'm recording this episode, because I can always splice in things here and there if breaking news comes out as I'm editing or something like that. But as of the recording of this episode, it's been a little bit of a slower week. However, there's something that's been on my mind recently, and you'll kind of notice that last week was a little bit. There were a few topics that have something in particular in common, and that is Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man obviously is one of the most popular characters ever. I'm not just talking about comic books. I'm not just talking about superheroes. I'm talking about literally one of the most popular fictional characters to ever exist, and I think that's been reflected in the MCU, which you have your 3 Spider-Man films, Spider-Man Homecoming, Far From Home, No Way Home, have grossed about, I think maybe something like $3.5 billion, or almost $4 billion, right? It's crazy how much money those 3 films have made. And it's just the popularity of the character. You have the Beyond the Spider-Verse, Across the Spider-Verse, Into the Spider-Verse films, and even the Venom films, which are not, necessarily Spider-Man films, but they're adjacent to the Spider-Man universe. Now, obviously, Madam Web and Morbius aside, but, Venom has as much closer ties to Spider-Man. So there have been a lot of rumors lately, and we're going to be talking about another rumor later on in the episode about the Scarlet Witch. But right now, I just wanted to talk about Spider-Man. So we have the confirmation, right? Kevin Feige has not gotten up on a stage and said, "This is Spider-Man, no multiverse, no home." I don't know what it's going to be called. But Spider-Man 4, and it's coming out in December 2025 is what I'm predicting. Kevin Feige has not come out and said anything like that. However, it's basically been confirmed. We talked about this in the last week's podcast episode. We talked about Spider-Man 4 being directed by Destin Daniel Cretton and what that might mean for the MCU moving forward. There have been a lot of reports recently as well from scoopers and from some people who have seem like they have some reliability, but also, again, a lot of people who seem to also get some things wrong sometimes, so we're just taking those with a grain of salt. But there have been a lot of rumors lately about Spider-Man 4. Some saying that Spider-Man 4 was supposed to be a multiverse film, and then it got, Marvel Studios was pushing it to be a street-level film, and Sony wants it to be a multiverse film. Another interesting rumor lately that says that Null, who appeared briefly, Null is the symbiote god, who appeared in the Venom The Last Dance trailer and will probably be playing some kind of significant role in that film. There are some rumors that says Null will be the villain of Spider-Man 4. I find that a little bit hard to believe, just because I think that the extent to which Marvel Studios proper wants to cross over the Sony universe into the MCU is questionable, because I just think aside from Venom and Venom Let There Be Carnage, there has not been a lot of success with that side of the Sony universe. However, it has been a rumor going around. So I thought we'd just take a second here, just as we introduce the podcast, to just talk about what we think Spider-Man 4 could and should be. Now, there are a lot of factors going into this, so I'm just going to lay the scene. I'm going to set the scene here, and then I'll talk about what I personally would hope a Spider-Man 4 could and should be. And again, this is just my own personal thought that has, if you had asked me after Spider-Man Far From Home, what do you think the third iteration of this Tom Holland Spider-Man should be? There's no way I would have said anything close to, oh, they should bring back Green Goblin, and how about Sandman and Electro and Doc Ock, and let's just throw in Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. No way. So when I say should, I mean it in jest. I mean it facetiously to say, yeah, I mean, sure. This is what I think based on what I know. I think they should be doing, but I have no right to say any of that. And if they come up with a great story that is completely different, that's awesome. I'm so excited for that. But let's set the scene here. So Spider-Man 4, I think at the earliest will come out in fall 2025. I think late fall, probably Christmas time 2025. If not, maybe very early 2026. However, here's why I'm going to tell you that's pretty unlikely. So if you know anything about the movie release calendar, you'll know that there are hot spots, right? There are certain months of the year where people, movie studios think that it's better to put out movies. Now, those things have been shifting around, right? And I think more and more we're seeing that pretty much every single month of the year you can put out a movie and have it be, somewhat successful at the very least. But I think there are some months that movie studios target as more successful than others. For example, May has pretty much become the official kickoff to the summer blockbuster season. That used to be the beginning of June. It slowly moved up to May. I don't see it creeping into April, although I know Infinity War and Endgame released at the very end of April. I don't see that being a major trend. I think those are just unique situations. But regardless, I think the very first weekend of May is very coveted because it's sort of the beginning of summer season. I think also Memorial Day is a big thing as well. And then obviously you have your summer season because, kids are out of school and people are relaxing a little bit more and maybe willing to go to the movies a little bit more. So summer is a big deal. And then you have your, your Christmas and Thanksgiving season. So those are some hot spots. Traditionally, January and February have not been known to be the hottest of months, not even weather-wise, just in terms of the box office, for movies. And even March, Marvel has released films in the past. They released Captain Marvel and it made $1 billion. So it's not like they can't release films in March and not have success. However, Spider-Man is a character that you absolutely want to maximize how much you can make. By putting it in the Christmas season for No Way Home, I believe that made a very tangible difference with how many people were able to see Spider-Man No Way Home. It made almost $2 billion. And I'm not saying that if you put it out in January, that it would have, would not have made would have made something like $300 million. No, nothing like that. I'm just saying that I think putting it out in January, like in the middle of January versus the Christmas season, would have been the difference. I genuinely think maybe between a couple $100 million. And that's just, to us, right? Us movie fans, when we're, looking at all these numbers, a couple $100 million, oh, whatever, Marvel goes from 1.7 billion to 1.9 billion, doesn't matter. But to them, that is $200 million worth of profit. And I'm just throwing out numbers here. I'm not trying to suggest anything. I'm just throwing out numbers for the sake of, for the sake of this exercise. So I think if they're going to start filming in early 2025, which is the rumor, which is the report, then the absolute earliest that I think a Spider-Man film could come out is probably Thanksgiving or Christmas. So let's just say Christmas because, keep it consistent with Spider-Man No Way Home. Because I just don't see it coming out anytime before that prime, maybe May release date of 2026, if it's not Christmas 2025. Now, the problem with that, the quote-unquote problem with that, is that May 2026 has a little movie coming out called Avengers Doomsday, right? And this is important because Spider-Man 4, we think, we could be wrong, but we think will, continue the MCU tradition of generally having these films take place in the same timeline, which means that, each film in each show generally comes one after the other. We have some exceptions for sure. Like Ant-Man and the Wasp is an exception, right? And so yeah, for sure, if Spider-Man 4 releases July 2026 and it takes place right before Doomsday, sure, maybe. I think it's a little weird. Like it's just a little strange if that happens. No pun intended, Doctor Strange. But they could do that for sure. But I'm operating under the assumption that they have their story and their story lines up with Doomsday in such a way that it's either taking place before or after. Now, the heavy rumor, this has not been confirmed at all, but the heavy rumor is that every film that takes place after Doomsday and before Secret Wars will be taking place in Battleworld or some version of Battleworld, because I think the big assumption, there have been some reports out there that have said Battleworld will be formed at the end of at the end of Doomsday. And so the films that will be taking place in between Doomsday and Secret Wars, and that could be a Doctor Strange 3, that makes more sense in terms of between Doomsday and Secret Wars. But who knows, right? Who knows what films come out between that? Maybe even Shang-Chi 2 could take place in there. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Probably not. But Spider-Man 4, it either depending on when it releases, right? It's going to take place either between Secret Wars and Doomsday or before Doomsday, is my opinion. I just don't see them waiting. They can't possibly release this after Secret Wars. So those are really the two options that we have going for us here. Now, what's interesting about that, like I alluded to before, is that this drastically changes what the story could be, right? Because depending on what you have, you either have a Spider-Man in New York, fighting some kind of, it could be anything. You could have anything. Spider-Man doesn't have to be in New York, but he's in some kind of normal Earth situation. Or you have Spider-Man in some version of Battleworld doing something crazy, right? So who knows? Who knows? But I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, like I mentioned earlier in this segment, is that there have been rumors about they wanted to go multiversal. Like Marvel Studios did not want it to go multiversal. They wanted it to be more street level, while Sony wanted it to be more multiversal because of the success of No Way Home. So that's sort of the scene. That's where we are. Also, just a reminder, at the end of Spider-Man No Way Home, we had Peter Parker in New York. He had his own costume, and we're setting up a lot of different things in the street levels of the MCU. So here is what I'm thinking about Spider-Man 4. First of all, if I had to choose between having it take place between Doomsday and Secret Wars and Battleworld or before Doomsday, it's no question. And I think a lot of you would agree with me here as well. I think it makes too much sense just to keep Spider-Man as Spider-Man and then have him go on the Avengers level expeditions in space and in the multiverse in the Avengers films. But in the Spider-Man film proper, I think even though No Way Home was a crazy multiverse film, he was still in New York. It was still Statue of Liberty, right? It's still Spider-Man. And I think Spider-Man 4, especially now that he's more grounded and he's more of a solo hero, it should definitely be in New York, and I think it should be in the normal Earth situation. Now, whether or not they do a multiverse film or they do a grounded street level film, if I had my preference, it would be a very much street level film. That doesn't necessarily mean it's kind of Punisher style or, Penguin level grounded, which obviously we'll be talking about the Penguin in a little bit, but it doesn't have to be that dark or gritty or mafia-esque or whatever. But I'm saying grounded as in, let's keep the stakes personal. Let's keep the stakes, less multiversal, which I think was able to keep the stakes still personal to Peter. But I think that what's really appealing about this character now is that we can go in a different direction that we haven't seen with Tom Holland before. And look, does that necessarily mean a Daredevil team up? Does that mean Daredevil and Spider-Man against Kingpin? I may say something unpopular here. I don't think it has to, right? I think it could, and it would be very cool. But I think also there is something so appealing about just seeing Tom Holland and just seeing Spider-Man be Spider-Man in this crazy world that he has to navigate, because it's enough for him just to be Spider-Man. They made so many films about it with Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield about just him being Peter Parker and him being Spider-Man, because that should be more than enough to carry a film. So in the end, right, I think that we're faced with a lot of potential options, and I'm very curious to see what Spider-Man 4 ends up being. But for me personally, I think I'm hoping for a more grounded solo adventure before he inevitably goes back and has to come face to face with the person, or with the face at least, of the person that he cared about the most in the Infinity Saga, and that's Tony Stark, aka now Victor Von Doom. So I think that'll be really interesting, and we'll see where we go from there. But I ask you guys, what do you think about Spider-Man 4, and what do you think the style of the film should be? Will it be more grounded, more multiverse? Will it take place in Battleworld? Would you prefer that? Let me know in the comments down below. All right, so before we get into Agatha All Along, and trust me, we will spend a good portion of today's episode talking about the first two episodes of Agatha All Along, let's talk about something else that's been going around recently. So we've all heard the rumors for a long time, especially those of you who have been following the YouTube channel and have been following the Marvel rumors. Scarlet Witch, is she dead? Is she not dead? And this is nothing about the first two episodes of Agatha All Along. I would have been able to record this entire segment. I promise you, no spoilers. I would have been able to record this entire segment before I had even seen episodes 1 and 2. I'm going to record this as if I hadn't seen episodes 1 and 2. So we're just talking about the fact that, look, before even Agatha came out, we had all been wondering, after Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, is Elizabeth Olsen as the Scarlet Witch? Is she ever going to come back in any form? And is the character dead in the MCU? And there have been, kind of things here and there, right, that have maybe confirmed our suspicions and that maybe have tilted us away from it. So we have Elizabeth Olsen herself going on several interviews recently, and she's had a pretty, a good lineup of projects after WandaVision and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. But let's not kid ourselves. It's only been 2 years. So it's not like she, if she were to do another MCU project, and let's say she does show up in Agatha All Along at the very end or whatever as Scarlet Witch, it would have only been 2 years since she had last appeared as Wanda Maximoff. So let's not pretend that it's this big hiatus and, Robert Downey Jr. stepped away. He probably by the time he shows up in maybe the Fantastic Four First Steps or in Avengers Doomsday, it will only have been maybe 6 or 7 years. And so it's not like it's been a 10-year hiatus or anything like that. But still, she's wanted to step away from the MCU after Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. That closed out her character and seemingly left her dead on Mount Wondergord, is what I believe that mountain's called. Anyways, so the character is now gone from the Earth 616 universe. Now, that never really predisposes a character from ever showing up again in the MCU. Captain America is still kicking around, and we have obviously Tony Stark and all these other villains that kind of show up again. Red Skull showed up again. So, we have all these different avenues for a character to show up. And so, like I said, Elizabeth Olsen has been going on talk shows recently and been saying, yeah, look, I'd be very open to coming back as Wanda Maximoff, as Scarlet Witch, when previously she had been saying things like, well, I think the time is over and whatnot. So who knows about that? And then recently, the reason that it prompted me to talk about this at all in the first place is that the showrunner of Agatha All Along, and I believe one of the head writers, if not the head writer of WandaVision, Jack Schaefer, was on the red carpet of Agatha All Along, and she basically said, we're really hoping that we're going to get that Scarlet Witch movie. And she didn't really confirm anything or not. So that's, this segment isn't really about news. It's not really me saying, hey, look at, we have signs that a Scarlet Witch movie is coming. It's not like the Ted Lasso segment I did a couple weeks ago where I was like, well, it kind of does look like Ted Lasso season 4 is on its way. This is me just more saying, okay, well, let's talk about what this could mean for the MCU if this were to happen. So, is a Scarlet Witch movie? Because I think, well, let's first back up a little bit. So Scarlet Witch movie is an assumption in itself. Let's just talk about the fact that, is Scarlet Witch coming back into the MCU a good idea? And then I guess secondly to that, is a Scarlet Witch movie a good idea? So I can pretty much bundle those two answers in one for me personally, because I think it just depends on everyone else. But I'm going to try to give some reasons also holistically for the MCU why I think that, I think the way that I think. Is bringing Elizabeth Olsen back as the Scarlet Witch a good idea? I'm going to say no. And I'm not saying this, trust me, if you've watched the channel for a long period of time, you'll know that I am one of those people who am obsessed with WandaVision. I don't think many people would even agree with me on this, even people who love WandaVision. But WandaVision to me is top 2 MCU ever. It's Infinity War for me, and it's WandaVision. I think WandaVision is just that good. And I loved Elizabeth Olsen as Scarlet Witch and pretty much everything else she's been in Civil War, Infinity War, Endgame. Obviously, she had a great little performance. I say little just because of the amount of screen time that she gave, but obviously, we all remember her moments with Thanos in there. And Infinity War, she just broke my heart at the very end with Vision, and WandaVision just killed it. And I'm a fan of Doctor Strange: The Multiverse of Madness. I don't think it's the greatest thing ever made, but I think it has some really fun moments in there. You can go check out my rewatch of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness right here on the channel. But look, I'm one of those people who also thinks that the whole idea of Wanda Maximoff, quote-unquote, breaking bad in Doctor Strange 2 as the villain, I mean, we can all have this conversation about whether or not they should have done it because, it seemed like a lot of people were kind of confused because they hadn't seen WandaVision going into Doctor Strange 2, so that's a whole different conversation. But I'm just talking about every single canonical appearance of Wanda Maximoff and her character arc. And I have been on record of saying it made total sense to me. It made complete and total sense to me that she went the direction that she wanted. Because, look, you have this character who people were saying that the main argument that I've heard, at least, against this is that in WandaVision, she completed her arc, right? She went through the processes of grief and everything like that. And so it doesn't make sense to just all of a sudden pivot her back to being a villain. Well, I would argue a couple things there. I think, first of all, I don't think that her journey was complete in WandaVision. I think actually if you watch the show until the very end, you'll remember that at the very end of the show, this is a character who, yes, has maybe atoned for, not even atoned, what's the right word? She has found some remorse for what she has done, and she's trying to find her way back, right? But this is a character who is still clearly dealing with grief, right? I mean, she's had to let go everything for the greater good, and she's had her hero moment, but I think it still makes sense that, okay, she's like, I understand this is all hurting people and this is all me. But then at the very end, she finds the Darkhold and she's messing with the Darkhold. And that's a moment when she can realize, wait, I don't need to, quote unquote, hurt anybody going through the multiverse and finding other versions of my kids. I can just find my kids, and that becomes an all-consuming thing for her. So that's point number one, being that I don't think her arc was necessarily complete in WandaVision. I think that she went through a very beautiful transformation and went through a lot of really emotional stages through in her life and in her processing of all the terrible and traumatic things that have happened to her. But I think also number two, that it makes total sense that if that, again, grief is not a binary thing. It doesn't just go away. That's really what my point is there. And so if you had the opportunity, right, to you kind of think one door is shut, but then all of a sudden it's like, well, there was a chance you could bring your kids back. I definitely think that it makes total sense that she would come back. I do think, however, that whatever you think about the execution of the character in Doctor Strange, I mean that, I guess I mean that in the sense of the execution of the character arc, but also literally the death of the character. But, whatever you think about the way that they handled Scarlet Witch and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and I definitely think that, they could have spent a little bit more time with her in the film rather than just making her a generic horror villain or whatever at certain points. I think that they definitely could have fleshed out her motivations a little bit more. But I do think that just on paper, the character arc makes total sense, that she finally is confronted with what she's wanted this whole time, and her kids are terrified of her because they kind of see her as a monster. She's kind of become that character who chased the dream so much that she lost herself in it. I think that's actually quite interesting. I don't think it's as interesting as WandaVision. I think by killing her at the end, her making the ultimate sacrifice play, it's again showing her that she is a true hero at heart and not, just an evil villain for the sake of being an evil villain. And I think that that's really good. So in the one sense, right, I talked about this like a little bit ago that, is it a good idea to bring back Elizabeth Olsen as Scarlet Witch? I don't think so, because I think that her character arc has come to a natural conclusion. Now, people can argue, okay, well, what about the multiverse and all that kind of stuff? Again, I have always been hesitant. The reason I'm so pro Robert Downey Jr. returning, not as Tony Stark, although he could be a Tony Stark variant for all we know, but not as Tony Stark, but as Victor Von Doom for the moment. And why, spoiler alert for Deadpool and Wolverine, I was very happy that Chris Evans was able to return as the Human Torch, is because the idea of, in Secret Wars, a giant portal opening up a la Spider-Man No Way Home, and guess what? Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. show up, and it's not the exact versions from the Earth 616 universe, but it's basically the same, and they're just showing up because they're showing up. I think the idea of that is really ridiculous and kind of silly. I think that, they're making interesting ways for these actors to show up again. And so if there's a way for Elizabeth Olsen as an actress to show up again, and even, things like I would not be opposed for her filming new scenes as flashbacks for the Vision series, for example. That's great. That's totally fine. It seems like a little bit of a waste of the actress to kind of just have her come back, Elizabeth Olsen, who I think is one of the most talented and really charismatic actresses in the business today. Just having her film some flashback scenes as a little bit of a cameo, if it serves the story, then that's great. But I think it's a little bit of a waste. But I think on the whole, for me personally, and for the MCU as a whole, I think we're kind of, I think we've wrapped up the Wanda Maximoff storyline. I think that we've told a lot that there has been to tell. Obviously, people are kind of, we're kind of hoping for House of M more in WandaVision. We didn't really get that, but I think, again, even if we're just bringing back the 3/8 version of Wanda, for example, I just think that's a little bit lazy and a little bit like, well, we kind of killed one of them, but we can always start over. And I think that is part of the danger of having the multiverse around, just to have these cop-outs. And I think so far with the cameos, apologies, by the way, for the siren in the background, my goodness, but anyways, like I was saying, I think for the most part, they've handled the cameos pretty well. I think, the Illuminati, they were kind of fun in Doctor Strange 2, but I'm talking more Tobey Maguire, I'm talking Andrew Garfield, Chris Evans as the Human Torch, for example, all the, I don't know what you call them, the Anarchy Avengers or whatever they were in Deadpool and Wolverine, and then, Robert Downey Jr. potentially coming back. It's not a cameo, he's the big bad of the multiverse saga, apparently. I think that they've handled them fairly well. So I would just be a little bit hesitant because of how well I personally think they handled the Wanda Maximoff arc in the MCU. But you'll have to let me know in the comments down below. Maybe you completely disagree with me, and maybe you think they should totally be making a Scarlet Witch movie. And yeah, I guess that's the second point I should address quickly, is just, I think that if you're going to bring her back, I don't necessarily think we need an entire movie. I think we've had an entire show, an entire movie where she was the main villain. I don't see it. But maybe you guys do, so let me know in the comments down below. All right, guys, let's talk about the 6th episode of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. And what a roller coaster we have been on so far. So just to catch you up to speed before we get into the full spoiler discussion, just talking about some of my thoughts on the series as a whole. I do this recap every single segment because we get new viewers every single segment. Thank you guys so much for watching, by the way, for listening to the podcast. But, just to catch you guys up, I was not a big fan of season 1. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, books and movies. Obviously, the movies are amazing, but the books I really enjoy as well. I'm actually currently rereading The Fellowship of the Ring. Been really enjoying that. But yeah, not a huge fan of season 1. Thought it was just nothing egregiously wrong, just kind of bland and a little bit boring. So I was skeptical heading into season 2. I loved episode 1 of season 2. I thought it was just great to see the manipulation of Sauron as he gets his plan in order. I thought episodes 2 and 3 were kind of, I think episode 2 was okay and episode 3 was fine for the most part. And then I really disliked episode 4. So it's been a little bit of a roller coaster. But last week, I think we got the best episode of the entire series. Just the Dwarven rings and seeing how they're affecting King Durin and how Sauron is working behind the scenes with Celebrimbor to really get the rings in the place that he wants them to get them. And even the stuff in Numenor, which I just haven't cared for the Numenor subplot at all in the first 2 seasons, has suddenly become a little bit more interesting to me with Elendil and the way that he, and we'll talk more about Elendil obviously in this episode, but in the last episode, just the way that he was handled with the whole mutiny scene and that soldier being killed, I just thought all of it was really, really good. So last episode I thought was one of the best episodes. I think the best episode of, I guess, the 13 that we had been given thus far. So we head into the 6th episode of season 2. And as always, this is going to be a full spoiler discussion. So if you have not seen episode 6 of Rings of Power season 2, just save this video, save the podcast for a little bit later, and then come back once you have seen it so we can all talk about the episode in spoilery detail. So episode 6. One thing I mentioned in last week's podcast when I was talking about episode 5 is that I think one of the reasons that episode 5 works so well is because it basically cut out the 2 arcs that are just so uninteresting to me in this entire show. And I think that for the most part in the previous season and then in the previous episodes, they had been focusing a good bit on these 2 arcs. And I don't think it's a surprise that episode 1 and episode 5 didn't really do so. Not really anyways. And those 2 arcs are Nori and Poppy and the Stranger. And, I guess there's some nuance there now that they're split apart. But just, before episode 5, I guess, or episode 4, Nori, Poppy, and the Stranger, that's one arc. And then Isildur, Theo, Arondir as the second arc. I just really could not find myself emotionally attached, to these characters really at all. And so it's not really a coincidence to me that episode 5 didn't really talk about these character arcs. And Numenor, to be fair, was one of those arcs that I just didn't really have any interest in. When the giant eagle came in episode 2 or whatever, I was like, or episode 3, I was like, yeah, that's kind of interesting, I guess. So episode 5, kind of just did away with that for a little bit at least, and dealt with the Sauron plot in general, which I think is the best part. But it's not like this show, now that it's completely shot and written and edited and everything like that, is they're able to ignore those character arcs and whatnot. So we will talk about them as they appear in this episode. Although I will say up front that the Theo, Arondir, Isildur arc is not really here in this episode, which makes me worried because it makes me think in episode 7 it's basically all going to be them, but I guess we'll get there when we get there. So we start out here, and I think it's really great that Celebrimbor is going insane. I think that the focus here on Celebrimbor, he has become instantly one of the most interesting characters. I'm not going to say my favorite because it's not like he's super charismatic or likable or relatable or anything like that. But one thing I love about this character is that he's so interesting because he is basically the case study in what a Sauron manipulation looks like, because he is the person that Sauron needs in order to fulfill his task of getting the rings. And I think it's becoming a little bit more frustrating to me because I think it's a little unclear what Sauron's endgame is here. Because obviously we know eventually, ultimately, he is the one, and it's mentioned in the books, it's mentioned in the movies, I believe, that Sauron forges the One Ring outside of Celebrimbor. So eventually he's going to break away from Celebrimbor. Maybe he dies in the next episode or so. I don't know, once he gets the 9 rings for men. But eventually Sauron is going to go to Mordor and forge the One Ring himself. But I think it's really interesting because Celebrimbor is this character who is the representation of what Sauron is doing to him, which I think, it's just fascinating also because of how important Celebrimbor is as a character. You forget actually because, and I think kudos to the show for being able to do this. As someone who read Lord of the Rings before and who watched the movies before, I'm sure they made mentions of all these things that are being talked about here. And it just went completely over my head. But now, now that I'm reading Fellowship of the Ring again, all these references have actually been in the Tolkien book. So I get it that there are a lot of things that hardcore Tolkien fans are upset about for the show. And, I trust me, I've had a lot of conversations with you guys. Thank you so much for discussing these things with me. It's really fun to talk about these episodes in the comments below. But a lot of diehard Tolkien fans have just not been a fan of the way that these writers have handled the show. I get it. I haven't myself read the Silmarillion, and I probably will at some point. But just in the main canonical I shouldn't say Silmarillion's canonical, but you know what I mean, like the main Lord of the Rings trilogy, if you're reading Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf really talks about the fact that, yes, there was, Gil-galad, who was the Elven King, and he had the rings and the Elven rings, and then there was Celebrimbor, and, and Eregion fell, and all these different things that are actually being displayed to us in front of our eyes, and I think that is really cool. I think if nothing else, the show is able to really help me get a more three-dimensional idea of what Gandalf was talking about when he talks about those things. So anyways, yes, Celebrimbor is going insane. And then Celebrimbor says, the deal with the dwarves, it's off. Sauron says they need more mithril. And then Celebrimbor is basically like, okay, well, let me just deal with the rings. And he says to Sauron, we go take care of the mithril, basically. He's like, we have no more mithril, so go take care of it. And Sauron being the clever character that he is like, okay. And he goes outside and basically is like, yeah, I'm in charge of everything now. Which I think is just really interesting. And again, one of the more fascinating parts of the show, just the manipulative nature of Sauron as a character. He also, the way that he's manipulating, is it Mirandia, the female elf, who is, he's kind of using a different kind of manipulation more, because I think with Celebrimbor, he's using the idea of work and we're almost there, and the kind of, let's do this for the Rings of Power. But, with Mirandia, he's using obviously more seduction and just a different side of this. I think the idea of what Sauron represents and what the One Ring represents of temptation, I think it actually plays out quite well here, which I've been very happy to see. That's a really great start to the episode. Now we move on very quickly to the Galadriel Adar subplot, which I think and I get it more now what they were going for at the end of the episode. So I think it's a fine thing for me, at the beginning of the episode when they first show up, to be like, I don't quite know how to feel about this. And I think now that I've watched the whole episode and watched the last couple episodes where Galadriel and Adar were together, I think it makes sense. I think that that's exactly what the writers were intending. So I think that that's a good job on their part, just to be like, I don't quite know what's going on here. Do I trust this? And does this make sense? It didn't quite make sense to me. And I think that is something that is to the show's credit. I also think that one thing Adar points out is that Galadriel's fatal flaw is her pride, which I think was mentioned in last season as well. But I think it's good to point out here that this is a character who is so proud of the heritage and the elven lineage that she comes from that she's really unable to see past it, which I think is, I think that that's a really interesting point to make for a character who is otherwise kind of bland and one-dimensional in the first season. So then we move back to Numenor, and we have Elendil, and we have the king, Pharazôn, setting Elendil free, but basically he wants him to it's the whole classic, bend the knee, and I'll let you go. And obviously Elendil, as the righteous man, the father of Isildur and everything like that, he refuses, and so then we get this whole other subplot as well, which we'll come back to in a little bit, because we are switching subplots very quickly, and we get back to Tom Bombadil. Now, here's an interesting parallel that I made with Tom Bombadil, as we see him take on kind of a mentor role, kind of just being a weird spirit guy, which he's very different, I will say, in this show than what I imagined him to be, because what I imagined him to be, based on the books, and again, this is just based on the books, so because we haven't seen him in live action thus far, is more of a Yoda character in The Empire Strikes Back. And I'm talking about, I guess, because after Yoda reveals himself to Luke Skywalker, he gets a little bit more serious. But, even after that, he's very whimsical, he's funny, he's just a crazy old man, but he has a lot of wisdom to him. And I kind of imagined that would be what, Tom Bombadil would be. But it turns out he's just a very somber, boring, kind of creepy character that I just didn't really imagine him to be. And we'll talk about the completion of that character arc, because I guess he's gone now. Maybe he'll probably come back, but, we'll see about that. Then we switch again to another subplot. I say this, I'm just talking about what's in my notes here. So it might seem like I'm a little frustrated with how fast they're switching the subplots, but I'm actually not. I actually think that they, for the most part, did a really good job pacing this episode. I think it's really coming to a head now, the show. It's episode 6. We only have 2 more episodes left. And I think that makes a lot of sense that we're having to switch between different story arcs because, this is what we're building towards finally. And even this is even while they had to cut out stuff of like Arondir, Theo, and Isildur as well, which are, I'm sure they'll come back next episode. But we get to the Nori, Poppy / nobody subplot. And it immediately, as soon as they come on screen, this is without Gandalf now. So it's like even less. So because I guess I'm not that interested in a Gandalf origin story. I'm just not. But it's Gandalf, and maybe it's not Gandalf, but it's Gandalf, right? So when Gandalf is with Nori and Poppy, I'm a little more interested, but just Nori and Poppy, and now this romance between Poppy and nobody, it is unbelievable how little I care about this storyline. And let me know in the comments down below, maybe this is just everyone else's favorite storyline, because for me, I just cannot stand it. I don't know why. Maybe it feels so inconsequential. It feels almost like, hey, the Hobbits were such a big part of the first trilogy that, we gotta make sure that, we have Hobbit-like people in this show. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. I don't buy any of it. It feels like we could have been spending all of this time with Nori and Poppy. I get it. You want to anchor Gandalf in something, but my goodness, it doesn't work. Luckily, it's just the one scene and then we move on. It's even this nobody character. It's awful, I think. Just terrible writing. And I couldn't even stand. I just can't stand this storyline. But anyways, moving on. Luckily, it moves on pretty quickly. And then we get another scene here with Tom Bombadil. And yeah, just going back to the Yoda parallels here, it's so interesting. He gives Gandalf basically the same speech that Yoda does in The Empire Strikes Back. Like, you got to finish your training. You can't just go off and fight. You got to finish your training. And Luke's like, I'll come back and finish my training. And then, obviously we saw what happened there. I just think that's interesting that I see at least a very strong parallel between what they're writing here and The Empire Strikes Back. But I digress. So then we get back to King Durin. And this scene here where King Durin is talking to Prince Durin is a great scene. Just a fantastic scene where you see him unraveling. And he's just so creepy. And I'm so invested now because I think Durin was never a sympathetic character to me. He was just kind of a funny, entertaining character in the previous season and early on this season. But I think what's really gotten me hooked onto this character is the relationship between him and his father. It works on so many different levels because you see a son really trying to get his father back from the brink, and you see how destructive his father's obsession with the rings are, and yet that there's nothing that's going to take him back until he takes off the ring. And then I think that's just great. Moving back to Elendil, he has this conversation with his daughter, and this is a quote that I wrote down. Look, I think the writing in the show can sometimes be pretty bad, but sometimes it can be really, really good. And this is one quote that really made me think. He says to his daughter, I believe, "It is hardly mercy to ask a man to set his integrity aflame." And that's just a great line. Something about that line really struck true to me about integrity and about, having faith. He even talks about faith in almost a religious sense where he's like, I have to live out my faith. I can't just sit here and proclaim something and not live out my faith. And I think that's so interesting. Obviously, if for those of you who don't know, J.R.R. Tolkien was a Christian. And so a lot of religious undertones and religious allegories in his books. And I think that I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it's kind of carrying over to the show. Not to say anything about any one particular religion or anything like that, but just wanted to point out the interesting allusions here that I personally saw. Anyways, so then we have we have now Disa basically saying, okay, I'm going to stand in front of this cave and summon bat creatures. And honestly, this was not one of my favorite parts of the episode because I don't know where they came from. Where's the Balrog, by the way? Because we know the Balrog is there. This is Khazad-dûm. I think Khazad-dûm is where the Mines of Moria end up being, and so the Balrog is there. I think we saw the Balrog in one of the trailers for season 2. So just curious where the Balrog is. It's been my understanding, and I could be wrong, that the Balrog is sort of this idea of be careful what you wish for. Obviously, they keep mining, they get treasures, but they're eventually going to run into the Balrog, and obviously Khazad-dûm is going to fail eventually. So we'll see what happens there. We end this episode with Adar and Galadriel. And it's confirmed now that Adar was really more just interested in learning the plans of the elves and understanding that Halbrand is Sauron and then forming a plan of attack. Galadriel, I think, rightly thinks that he's just going into to Halbrand/Sauron's trap. And it's interesting because I keep thinking about, why does Sauron want Eregion to fall? What's the reason, right? Is it just because he wants to get rid of Celebrimbor as soon as the rings are forged? I mean, he spends so much time. There's the whole illusion thing, which I think is really interesting as well, to make Celebrimbor think that everything is fine while it's basically in flames. I think that was a really cool sequence. But I guess what I'm left with here is also, where did Sauron get the mithril, by the way? I don't remember him taking it. Maybe I just completely missed it. But anyways, what I'm left with here, just plot-wise, is wondering why, I guess, what Sauron's endgame is here. Like I mentioned before, is it really to forge the One Ring at this point? Does he know about that? Or does he just want the kingdoms of Middle-earth to fight one another? Because that's what's happening. And if that's what's happening, then good job. I wish that we had a little bit more insight into Sauron himself, right? I think it's really cool that we get to see the manipulative parts of Sauron, but I'd like to know what is making Sauron himself tick, if that makes sense. But at the end of the day, right, as we finish out our discussion of this episode, I thought this was another solid step forward. I think that while this is not personally my favorite episode of the season or the series, it's very solid. It's very high up there. I think it's probably third behind episode 5 is episode 1, and now it's episode 6, because I think it's continuing a lot of the things that are really strong about this season, which is Sauron, Celebrimbor, the rings, even Adar, Galadriel, some of the Numenor stuff I think is really good as well. Well, yes, there's a couple scenes here with Tom Bombadil that I think are weird, and the Nori, Poppy, Nobody storyline is just really grating on me at this point. But aside from that, so those are just little scenes here and there. I thought that this episode was really strong in continuing the story forward. Now, like I said before, they're going to wrap up the Nori Poppy storyline at some point, so we're going to get more of that. We're going to get more of Theo and Isildur and Arondir, and that's not stuff I'm looking forward to. So again, no matter what happens, right, this is not going to be the perfect season of Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. But there is potential here, and I hope that, again, for me personally, right, because other people might really enjoy those subplots, but for me personally, if I were to see a season 3, and I can't imagine they're not going to greenlight a season 3 because they greenlit a season 2 and the reception to season 1 was even worse, than season 2. So I'm sure they'll greenlight a season 3. If we're going to see a season 3, I'd like to cut back on the storylines a little bit. There's just a lot going on here. I know you want to tell the fall of Numenor, and I know you want to do Sauron and Dark Wizard and Gandalf and whatever. Let's maybe cut back on the Nori Poppy storyline, and let's just focus on Isildur maybe as it pertains to him and his eventual downfall as the somebody who takes the One Ring. But I'll leave it to you guys. Let me know in the comments down below. What did you guys think of episode 6 of The Rings of Power? Was this your favorite, least favorite, or somewhere in between episode of season 2 or the whole series? Let me know in the comments down below. I would love to continue discussing this with you guys. Alrighty, guys, let's talk about the latest entry into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Let's talk about Agatha all along. So if you've been following the channel for a little bit now, you'll know that I haven't been particularly excited about Agatha all along. Nothing in the marketing has made me all that thrilled, to be quite frank. And, nothing about the concept of the show, nothing about even the announcement or what it was going to be about, the Witch's Road, everything like that. Just nothing got me super thrilled and jazzed to be watching the show, I'm not going to lie. Now, if you've also been watching the channel for a long time, you'll know that I am the kind of person who says, that's all of our expectations, it's totally fine. We can all say, look, this poster looks bad, the trailer doesn't look good, whatever. I don't think this actor seems to fit the role just based on, whatever promotional material has come out. But then I'm always the kind of person who leaves my expectations at the door because I've been pleasantly surprised so many times. For example, recently, Inside Out 2, I said, there's just no way it can top the original being perhaps my favorite movie of all time. And it didn't top the original, but it came close. It's a fantastic movie, and I would have robbed myself if I went into the movie saying it's gonna suck and it's gonna be terrible. And I enjoyed the movie, but then I came out of it being like, well, I can't say I liked it. So anyways, all that to say, I wasn't super excited about Agatha all along, but I went into these first 2 episodes, as we're going to talk about here in full spoilery detail, with some interest and really with an open mind to say, okay, let's see what you got. So this is going to be a full spoiler discussion about episodes 1 and 2 of Agatha all along. The episodes premiered on Wednesday, September 18th, and they will be coming out, I believe, weekly until pretty much Halloween time. And so that's pretty exciting. So if you have not seen episodes 1 and 2 of Agatha all along, just save the video, come back to it later, because this will be a full spoiler discussion. You have been warned. So we'll be talking about the episodes in detail. I wrote some notes down, as I always do, and then we will be kind of just going through the episode, doing a play-by-play and talking about the different details that I noticed and what I was thinking along the way. And then, of course, at the end of each episode, as I talk about each episode one at a time, I'll be doing some quick thoughts, and then we'll do some overall thoughts at the very end of this segment. So, without further ado, let's get into Agatha All Along. So, seeing the trailers, right, we had known that at least part of the beginning of the show, and this was just apparent from the trailer, was going to be about Agatha breaking out of Wanda's spell. Really, a lot of questions, because, what we had heard from a lot of critic reactions, which, just to sidebar for a quick second, a lot of the critic reactions to the show actually were quite positive, which was really interesting because they didn't, they didn't lift the embargo until quite late, the review embargo until quite late before the show came out, so it was really interesting, but critics were generally pretty positive. Now, I want to caution by saying, unlike a situation like Rings of Power, where it seemed like the critics got all 8 episodes and most of them generally enjoyed the entire season, the critics here only got 4 episodes. And it's tricky, right? Because Disney Plus has been really good at making good episodes 1 to kind of the beginnings of seasons, right? I can't really think of a Disney Plus MCU show, Star Wars show, that hasn't delivered at least the first couple episodes. And I'm even talking about Secret Invasion. I thought had a lot of promise, even though I don't hate the show as much as everyone else does. I don't particularly love it either. Secret Invasion, though, Loki, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Hawkeye, Miss Marvel, She-Hulk, I thought the first couple episodes of all of those shows were quite solid. So, take that with a grain of salt. I believe there's 9 episodes in Agatha All Along, and just because the critics saw 4 episodes and most of them say they liked it, I'm not going to take that to the bank. That being said, I took this as a good sign because obviously you don't want the alternative where they come out of the first 4 episodes and they say, yeah, it's not really good. So there is that to consider. But yeah, so the critics seem to really like it, at least the beginning parts of the show. And one of the things they talked about is that the first couple episodes are going to be a little bit slower, and some critics were not as happy about that as others, but most critics said then it picked up in episodes 3 and 4 on the Witch's Road. So, let's talk about episode 1 because it starts out, right? We've seen it in the trailers. Agatha is still under Wanda's spell. And I think that, there are all these stories coming out about Vision Quest, right? Or the Vision show. And Vision, the show Vision being the third part of a trilogy of WandaVision, Agatha All Along, and Vision Quest, or whatever the Vision show is going to be called. And I thought, that's kind of cute, right? I mean, it doesn't really feel like that's the case. It just kind of feels like that's your way of trying to tie everything together when, especially the Disney Plus shows, have not been as interconnected as the movies. And even the movies aren't as interconnected anymore. But, in fairness, right, I immediately, as I was watching the show, I went, no, this is picking up, literally, it is a spiritual successor, but it's almost a literal successor to WandaVision, because while Wanda has gone off since the end of WandaVision and 3 years have passed, right, it's 2021 to 2024, 3 years have passed since WandaVision, and Wanda has since died, as far as we know. Again, she might come back in the show, she might come back later in the MCU, but one has died, and Agatha has been under the spell for 3 years, but it still feels like a very direct continuation. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are still in Westview, right? So there is that, and we do see a lot, if not pretty much every single other supporting character that was in WandaVision. We get to see pretty much all of them. Herb, Norm, Mrs. Hart, who is now Sharon Davis, I guess, who is on the Witch's Road, which we'll talk about her more in episode 2. Deborah Jo Rupp, just, giving another great performance as well. I will always remember her from Friends, but as being Alice, but, just a really wonderful presence to have back in the show. But we get to see all of these, Dottie, we get to see all of these WandaVision characters back, and I was surprised to see how it actually affected me, not emotionally necessarily, but just to say, oh yeah, this feels like the same world, right? It feels like, oh, we're returning back to Westview, and a place that I had such fondness for, because, for those of you who don't know, WandaVision is something I hold it near and dear to my heart. Obviously, for the time it came out, we had nothing else to watch, and it was just a perfect storm, if you will, of just when it came out, but also just because I love the show. I've seen it again since, and we've talked about it on the channel. Just love the show. So anyways, even before that, though, I wanted to point out, even before we get to the whole Detective Agnes thing, we start out with Marvel Television. And I don't think it's the first time, well, actually, no, it is the first time that we've seen the Marvel Television banner. So I just wanted to talk about it a little bit briefly, because earlier this year, we saw Marvel Spotlight with Echo, which is interesting. And then now we've seen Marvel Television. We saw Marvel Studios with Deadpool and Wolverine. I don't know how I feel about this, guys. Honestly, I think I would have just preferred put Marvel Studios. You got to own everything that you make, right? Because here's the thing. I understand that, you made something like The Marvels, which I think was fine. And you had Miss Marvel, and, from the show Miss Marvel, which I thought was really good overall. Not every single episode, but overall pretty good. But it backfired because you brought over television characters into the big screen and nobody really cared to see that, right? So I get it. They're probably very hesitant now to even cross over TV characters into movies, and they just kind of want to make it segmented. Like you have, Agatha all along. You have Ironheart, who was in the movies, to be fair, to start, and then, going into Disney Plus now, but then even characters like Nova and Wonder Man who have shows coming out, and Vision seems like he's just kind of being sequestered over here. So, and She-Hulk, as well. So it's interesting that they're dividing it into Marvel Television and Marvel Spotlight. Marvel Spotlight, I don't even know what that is. Is that just like, hey, not important to the MCU, but here's a show that we greenlit and we're gonna make. I don't love that, honestly. It's something I wanted to point out, not something I want to talk about too much longer, but just something I noticed with the Marvel Television branding at the beginning. But anyways, so we get to the beginning of the show and we see Agatha. She is still Agnes, and it's a very similar vibe to WandaVision because she is now trapped in a reality and she doesn't quite know what's going on. She's almost replacing the Vision role in WandaVision, where you have this character who doesn't really know what's going on, but that something is off, albeit it really just spans one episode. And I'm kind of glad that they did that because while I loved WandaVision and while I love the concept of, the reality bending and not knowing where you are, not knowing who you are, I think that if you did this for too long, it would have felt very derivative of WandaVision. And I don't think that that's what we really wanted. So thankfully, by the end of episode 2, it feels like a very different show. And we'll see where that goes, for better or for worse. But a lot of allusions, to her being under the spell, a lot of little puns here and there. I think they mentioned things like hibernation. And obviously you see, characters that we're familiar with from WandaVision, like Herb. So it's really interesting just to kind of see, I think they had a lot of fun writing these scenes out because it felt, they got to kind of dip back into the well of WandaVision and kind of work with this reality bending sort of plot here. So then we see, presumably, some manifestation of Wanda's dead body. Allegedly, I'm not even sure what that's supposed to be, because I think, again, a lot of this is supposed to be in Agatha's mind, right? Because I think, what we realize as she breaks out of the spell is that she's been living, so it's not like she's been kind of quarantined or isolated on her own. She's been living in the neighborhood, but her neighbors just kind of treat her as crazy Agnes or, crazy whatever. But I think that it's interesting that she sees this dead body, and I wonder this probably isn't the literal dead body of Wanda Maximoff, but it is a fairly accurate representation, the burnt fingers and everything like that. So I wonder if this is sort of Agatha's mind reckoning with the fact that the person who put her under this spell is dead now, and then you just kind of have this physical representation of it in her mind. Not even sure. I'm not entirely sure about that, but just a theory and a thought that I had. Elizabeth Olsen, they don't show her face. I probably, for the reasons that I listed above, just because we don't know who it is, the mystery, but also because if you showed Elizabeth Olsen's face, you probably had to pay her, even if it was just a mannequin or whatever. So there is that. But yeah, I mean, this show at the beginning feels very much like a TV show because it is going for that same vibe of WandaVision. It's kind of spoofing the detective show. I like the intro a lot. I like that it's called Agnes of Westview, just like how WandaVision played off of all the sitcom tropes and things like that. I really did enjoy all of that as well. So yeah, a lot of my questions in these notes here as we're going through episode 1 was really about the people, right? I was thinking, okay, if Wanda lifted the hex, then how do all these people, Norm, Dottie, Herb, all these people in the hex, how did they still remain in the hex? And I think we kind of learn, and I think my best guess for this theory is that, well, I think it's just Agatha kind of trying to represent it in her own mind, because she's the only one in the hex, but everyone else has moved on and they still live in Westview. But that was my question throughout the majority of the first episode. The other thing I noticed actually in this first episode is that the music was quite good. There are some pretty creepy piano tones and some pretty ominous sounds, and I think the music fit the ambiance really well. It's not something I notice a lot with these television shows or with movies that are in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, quite frankly, because other than maybe an Alan Silvestri who does the Avengers scores, it's not a lot of the music, maybe Michael Giacchino as well, not a lot of the music is super memorable, but it just I think that it stood out in a really interesting way. Then we get the introduction of Aubrey Plaza, who is playing, I believe her name is Rio Vidal, and she kind of infiltrates into this vision, and she's good. I'm very used to her. What I know her from is Parks and Rec. Ironically, Catherine Hahn also Parks and Rec, so there's a little bit of a crossover there as April Ludgate. And if for those of you who've seen Parks and Rec, she's a very dour, cynical, sarcastic kind of character. And here, I think she's playing, I don't know, sinister, even seductive in a certain sense. I think it's really interesting that she gets to play a very different side. And I think that she does a really good job, especially, she's infiltrating these, I don't know, not dream sequences, but, really reality bending, mind warping sequences where she's in Agatha's head and she's kind of hinting to the fact that, okay, you're in a fake reality, but we'll just kind of play along. And I think that is really, really interesting as well. And then we get the reality starting to crumble around her as Joe Locke is introduced. So Joe Locke, steals something. We're going to call him Teen because I know the temptation is going to be to call him Billy, or Wiccan or whatever. And I'm pretty sure, I think I'm about 90% sure that he is playing Billy or Wiccan or whatever, Wanda's son in some interesting way. I'm sure that they'll have a reason for it because they're building it up as the central mystery to the show, which I think is interesting. So they better have a good payoff for it. I'm going to call him Teen because against my, better judgment, I think that I really think that he is Billy or Wiccan because we've kind of suspected this for a long time, even before the show came out. But I think there's something nagging in the back of my head, the 15% that goes, they might be pulling something interesting here. They might be trying to do something subversive. And I just want to kind of temper my own expectations. So we're just going to let the mystery play out. But anyways, Teen, Joe Locke, I might even just call him Joe Locke for the majority of the season as we break these episodes down. But Joe Locke breaks into Agatha's house and then he gets captured, and then we see this interrogation scene, and I really do enjoy the scene where the reality is kind of bending around her and she sees the painting and the pictures turn into pictures of flowers, and I think that is a really great representation of how the spell is crumbling and how her mind is crumbling. I do like Joe Locke as well. We'll talk more about him in episode 2, but I think he's got the right mix of angst in this episode and spunkiness and what I don't even know what the right words are to describe it, but I think he's a really good counterbalance to Agatha, at least in her own reality, because I think their dynamics change quite a bit in episode 2, which we will talk about as well. And then we get the scene with Rio as she confronts Agatha in the room where Wanda's body is, and I actually really like, because in the trailers it kind of seemed like it was pretty corny and goofy, and there are some bits of this episode and these 2 episodes that are corny and goofy, but for the most part it actually works quite well, because I thought that the scenes where she was going through the old outfits from WandaVision in the trailers, I thought that's a bit goofy. She's kind of hamming it up, because the last outfit we see in the trailer and the last outfit she wears is the one from the 60s, the first episode of WandaVision. But I actually love how almost horrific it is that she's clawing her way out of Wanda's hex or Wanda's spell, which I think is a really interesting, I don't know, just a really interesting twist to all that. I think that the show isn't scary necessarily, but it has a good tone, and it's setting a good tone. And I'm curious to see how they're going to, mess with that and how they're going to pull it off as the show progresses. So yeah, the waking up part I actually thought was really interesting. Would also love to see some more about Rio and Agatha as they start fighting, and then just would love to get more of their backstory, which I'm sure we will. And then Rio mentions the Salem 7, which we see them in episode 2. They just kind of seem like a bunch of zombie characters, which I don't know. No pun intended every time I say witch, by the way. I'm just saying witch. But yeah, I don't really know. I mean, it's the second that Rio said the Salem 7, I kind of went, generic villain alert. Maybe they're just cannon fodder, and Rio Vidal or Mephisto or Scarlet Witch reincarnated is the real villain of the show. I don't know. But yeah, I thought that Aubrey Plaza got to give even more unhinged performance in the scene where she's in the actual reality, which I think was really cool. And the episode ends, and that kind of shocked me, because I actually was having a really good time with this first episode of Agatha. What also tripped me up, because I thought, there's a lot of time left or whatever. Disney Plus did that crazy, stupid, annoying thing where they said the episode's 42 minutes long, and it's literally 35 minutes. It's 35 minutes because 7 minutes are credits, and that's crazy. That's almost, I would have just preferred it to have said 35 minutes at the beginning and then just left the rest to credits. So anyways, yeah, I think I took it as a good sign that episode 1 ended, and then I went, actually, no, I kind of wanted to see more. Luckily, I do get to see more, because episode 2 is called Circle, Sewn with Fate, Unlock the Hidden Gate, which is a reference to the lyric in that song that they sing, which we will discuss at the end of this segment. So Yeah, I like how Agatha, after she wakes up from her spell, or Wanda's spell, is just kind of manic. I think that that's a really good energy here. And then we get some exposition. So this episode, I think, is probably less strong than the first episode, because I think the first episode had a lot of the strengths from WandaVision. This episode was a little more exposition heavy, a little bit more just trying to, Agatha being a recruiter and then just kind of going through the motions in that regard. There were a couple interesting things at the end, especially, but as we go through through this episode, I think there's a little bit less to really dissect here. But, one thing that's interesting that teen Joe Locke's character says is that what's at the end of the Witch's Road is whatever you want, basically. And that kind of gave me flashbacks to Eternity and Thor: Love and Thunder, which was not a great thing in that film. I honestly thought that just the whole idea of, you get whatever you want if you do this quest or whatever. It's just not super appealing to me. One of the worries I have about this show is, okay, we have 7 episodes left. You're telling me that you've laid out basically the roadmap of the show. It's just, we're just going to walk down this road until we get to the end, which I know is, the Wizard of Oz, right? Like, it's a classic story or whatever. The hero's journey just kind of represented by a road, even though Agatha is an anti-hero villain. I don't know. But I'm just a little bit nervous. How are you going to fill these 7 episodes if you're just going to walk down the Witch's Road and then maybe run into obstacles every now and then? So we'll see. We'll see about that. But yeah, one of the most interesting things, they're setting it up to be the big mystery of the series so far, is who Joe Locke is playing, who Teen is. I think it's actually really well executed, the fact that every time he tries to reveal things about himself, he can't, whenever he says his name, his name doesn't come out. And I think that that's actually really fascinating. I think Joe Locke in this episode he gets to be, who the character actually is, not the version of the character that was in Agatha's mind. And he's charming. Although I will say, I think that it's on the borderline for me, because he is asked to be basically a super fan of witches. And he's not really given a ton of other things to really be in this episode. I'm sure he will get a lot more dimensionality, a lot more character as the series progresses. But in this episode, he really is just told to be a fanboy of witches. And I don't think that plays as well as they thought it might. I think he's just kind of coming off as, he's very charming. Obviously, he's very charismatic and he's very fun. He brings a very fun energy that really matches Catherine Hahn's kind of manicness, if you will, especially when they're recruiting the other witches. It's cute, it's fun, it's really interesting to see. But just as a character, it's it's a little, I don't know, it's just not quite clicking for me on that 3-dimensional level. Right now, it's just fun to watch, is what I will say. I also did get the feels when Agatha walked by the Wanda house lot. I thought, that's one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the MCU, and you had to walk by it, and then she spits in it because, of course, it's Agatha Harkness. I think that's part of the fun of the character, is that she has no respect. She has no regard for anything. She just wants what she wants, and we'll see if her heart kind of melts a little bit. Anyways, the other big gripe I had with this episode is that I feel like it was a little too quick of Agatha being convinced by Teen to go on the Witch's Road, because I think the second that Joe Locke convinces Agatha, hey, we need to go on the Witch's Road, she has a little bit of hesitation, but then all of a sudden she's like, oh, I don't know your name, let's go. And I was like, it felt a little quick. Now, it's mitigated a little bit by the end of the episode, because, I think that there are some more interesting ulterior motives that she had there. But I still think it was just a little quick for her to kind of trust this Joe Locke character when she had no idea who he was, even a day ago. So I think that's interesting. They're driving along. They're going to recruit other witches. And then he gets a call from Boyd, who I'm assuming is his boyfriend. And let's begin the whole aerospace engineer theorizing again. Who's Boyd? Is Boyd who does Wiccan end up with in the comics? I forget. It's another Young Avenger, right? But maybe it's that character. I don't think so, but who knows? Who even knows? You'll have to let me know in the comments down below if you have any. I can't believe this is where we are with shows like WandaVision and Agatha. But who is his name even Boyd? I think it's Boyd, right? I could be wrong. It went by pretty quickly, but you'll have to let me know in the comments down below. Anyways, Agatha goes to meet the first witch, and basically the rest of my notes here until the very end were me just trying to write down all the characteristics of the different witches, because these are going to be the main characters of the show. So we have Lilia, I believe she's the diviner. By the way, Agatha doing her best Benoit Blanc impression, which I think was really fun. She's just, she's great. Catherine Hahn is just so committed to every role that she's in, and she's just great. But yeah, she's the diviner. Agatha's being a recruiter. The word she says the word coven up at one point, which I think is kind of an interesting term to describe the process of needing the coven to get to the Witch's Road. I thought that was a little over the top, but whatever. I did laugh actually out loud a couple times. I wrote them down. In this episode in particular, I think that the line where Agatha is like, "This is my pet. Say hi, pet." That just got me for some reason. It was really funny to me. But I still, as I was watching it, I was still going, okay, so I'm not entirely sure why she's trusting him that much to kind of just tag along, even though all he's proven is that he's a super fan and there's something interesting extra about him. But whatever, we'll see. So we have Lilia, who is the divination witch, and then we have Jennifer Kale, I believe. She is the potions witch. Okay. And then we have Alice, who is the protection witch, I believe. And then, finally, I think it's implied that Rio Vidal is the green witch. But then I actually thought this was really funny. And I stand by this. I think it's really funny that they're taking Deborah Joe Rupp along. What's her name? Sharon Davis. I think that's really funny. If they keep her around through the rest of the show, which I hope they do, I think it's actually super funny to have a non-powered character there just to kind of balance out the comedy. Because if we're gonna go in the direction of horror comedy, I think that's actually a really funny thing to do for the show. So I'm a big fan of that. And obviously, Deborah Jo Rupp, she's great. She's really great. So there's that. Also, later on in the episode, Joe Locke makes a reference to the fact that his mom is dead. So again, if he's Billy, then we'll see. I mean, Billy, the Scarlet Witch in the 616 universe didn't have kids. So, if it's an 838 Billy or whatever, his mom is still alive, I think. So yeah, that's it's just something to keep an eye on. Pretty much everything that Joe Locke says that has anything to, in reference to something else that we don't know about is going to be something that I'm sure a lot of us will be keeping track of as well. But it's also really interesting that it's not only when he says his name, but then when he starts talking about where he comes from, that all of that sound kind of gets blocked out and Agatha can't really see that. Although I will say, speaking of Agatha and this teen character, I think Agatha's a little bit too mean to him. I know that Agatha is not necessarily a good person, but we're meant to see her as the protagonist of this series for better and for worse, I think, just because she's a kind of a villainous character, especially in WandaVision. But she is a bit cruel to this guy. I don't know. On the one hand, she trusts him a lot and she's buddy-buddy with him. And then on the other hand, she's tearing down his welcome to the coven, signs. And I think that's a little bit mean, but whatever. So then we get to the end of the episode and then they're singing the song. And the witches outside are multiplying, and I thought that effect was actually super creepy. I thought that worked really well. The fact that you have Herb, I think, and then the teen character standing outside, and then all of a sudden the witches are multiplying and running around. I think that was actually pretty creepy. I don't think it was that scary, particularly when they were in the house, especially when the one kind of fell down the stairs as they were entering the Witch's Road. But I think that for what it is, I think that it's not like it took me out of the episode necessarily. Now, talking about the song, as I promised we would, I think that the song started out pretty corny. I'm not going to lie. I don't necessarily love that they had to sing a song to enter the Witch's Road or, whatever they were doing. That being said, I think that as the Salem 7 were attacking the house, I think the song actually got creepier and creepier. And especially as the other harmonies entered in. By the way, love the shots of Sharon Davis, Mrs. Davis, just singing along and having a great time, not knowing what's going on. I think that's really funny. That's awesome. But yeah, I think as the song went along and as the attack went along, I think that it worked a lot better. And so I was a lot happier with it in general. So I think that was something that was definitely good there. But it was a little bit corny. I definitely think that the fact that, again, we sing a song and then we open a door and it's like, okay, sure. That's interesting. The other interesting thing, though, is that there's an allusion to the fact that Agatha was never really planning on having a coven and maybe even never planning on going down the Witch's Road at all. And she just wanted the witches there and then she wanted their power. And then the fact that the Witch's Road opened was probably an unintended consequence of that. And I think that is actually really clever because it's showing how Agatha is still breaking out of that villain persona. And I think we'll see throughout the rest of the series how that manifests and how that plays out. But they are on the Witch's Road. They take off their shoes. I know that they, there are a lot of behind the scenes, I guess, videos and reels of them walking on the Witch's Road. So I think a lot of it is a practical set, but it looks really good. It's not one of those practical sets that looks really cheap. And if they can do it this way, I think obviously it's always better to do practical, most of the time I should say, practical sets than green screens and CGI sets. And there they go, down the Witch's Road. So we'll see in episode 3 what happens. Again, my one big concern is that they have now just set up, okay, we're going on the Witch's Road for 7 episodes, and then there will be some obstacles, and they'll get sidetracked, and eventually they'll end up at the end, and then we'll see what happens there. So I'm just curious to see how they're going to fill the rest of the series. But these first 2 episodes, look, I said before, I wasn't particularly looking forward to this show. That being said, I think that a lot of what they were setting up here was really good, because I think it was just really solid in how they were portraying Agatha, how the tone was set up, and what the characters were doing. And I had a really good time with these first 2 episodes. So you'll have to let me know in the comments down below, what did you think of these first 2 episodes of Agatha All Along? Are you looking forward to the 3rd episode? We did a little bit of a bigger breakdown here. These segments, probably won't be as long in future Access Blockbusters Pod episodes, but also there aren't a lot of topics to talk about in the episode anyways. At least by the time I'm recording this, I might have to add things as things come out. But yeah, so I just thought let's do a deep dive on the first 2 episodes of Agatha All Along, and of course we'll be talking about other things as well. So again, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of Agatha All Along episodes 1 and 2. All right, let's talk about the Penguin. So we are in just a great time. We are in a great time because there are so many shows coming out right now. We have 3 major shows, one from Marvel, one from DC, and one from The Lord of the Rings. And it's just an awesome time. I talked earlier about Agatha All Along, and I really did enjoy those 2 episodes, but you can go check out, if you're listening to the segment, you can go check out either the full podcast or the other segment about Agatha All Along. Really enjoyed it though. But let's talk about the Penguin, because look, it's been a while. It's been a while since I've seen the Batman, and it's been a while since I visited that universe, but I remember I saw the movie at least 2 or 3 times in theaters, and a couple more times after that. And it's a universe that it was endlessly fascinating to me. The way that Matt Reeves was able to ground his Batman universe in a way that was different and distinct from Christopher Nolan's. His universe almost felt more crime drama-esque, where Nolan's Batman, I feel like, felt like today's world, like the real world, but in a Batman grounded kind of way. Matt Reeves' Batman feels like it's just part of this crime drama, which is really awesome. I think it's just such a cool thing that we get to have different iterations of Batman and different iterations of Gotham City all over the place. And I think that it truly is a testament to how different you can make these comic book movies and shows, and how you can create entirely different worlds in them as well. So we got Batman, and we were going to get the Batman Part 2. However, in between, because the Batman Part 2 is allegedly not coming out until 2026, or even probably 2026, but hopefully not 2027. But in between, Matt Reeves was developing a little TV show called The Penguin. Now, for those of you who have seen The Batman, which I'm assuming is pretty much everyone here, because this is a full spoiler discussion of The Penguin. For those of you who have seen The Batman, Penguin was a revelation, because Colin Farrell is an Academy Award nominated. I don't believe he's won. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe he has won. Maybe he did win for Banshees of Inisherin. I don't remember. But he is an Academy Award nominated actor, and he's just phenomenal. And he sinks his teeth into pretty much every single role that he's ever given. And he's not afraid to do these kind of big blockbustery kind of roles. If you guys remember, he actually played the villain. I know it ended up being Johnny Depp in disguise, but for all intents and purposes in The Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, he was the main villain, and Grindelwald in disguise. And he's definitely not beyond doing these kinds of things. In fact, I think he's really one of those actors who's so versatile and so game and willing and able to do anything in this space. So that's really awesome. And when we saw him as Penguin in the Batman, I mean, for me personally, it was just a revelation to see how he disappears into a role. Like, it is so incredible to see him in the makeup. It's so incredible to see him acting. And it was just a great thing. That being said, when they announced that they were doing a Penguin show, I was just excited to get back to the Batman universe, but if you were to ask me, oh, make a spin-off show, my first choice would have been Arkham, which they have now since canceled, or something else, right? Something else that wasn't really focused on the Penguin. But then the first trailers came out, the first promos came out, and it was really exciting because it looked like this was going to be really, a superhero show in name only. And I don't mean that to disrespect the superhero genre. I just mean that it's not really focused on aliens coming down from the sky or whatever. It's just a crime story with Oz. I guess he's called Oz Cobb now. His name's Oswald still, but, they kind of changed it from Oswald Cobblepot to Oz Cobb, which is fine. Totally fine. It looked fantastic. The first reactions, the first reviews were amazing. And so I was actually quite excited to get into the first episode, which is airing on a Thursday, and then the subsequent episodes, it won't be the next Sunday, in 3 days, but it will be 10 days after the first episode, and then it will be on Sundays from there on out. So really excited about that. Now, we are going to enter into a full spoiler discussion of episode 1. A lot to talk about. I guess maybe not as much plot wise, but just lots to talk about, with this episode. So if you haven't seen the first episode of The Penguin, just save this podcast or save this segment for later, and then come back once you have seen episode 1 of Penguin. This is your full spoiler warning. Let's get into it. So we start out here. It's not necessarily a previous on, but it kind of serves as a previously on as we get back into the Batman universe. And right away, I love being back. It's just so stylized and so different than anything else we've been getting in the superhero space, and it makes me really miss this world. That first Matt Reeves' Batman film, while it may not necessarily be my all-time favorite Batman movie, I'm still a big believer in Batman Begins. I love The Dark Knight as well. But I just do love the Batman and love a lot of things that Robert Pattinson was able to bring to that role. And so just being back in this universe, we also hear the Batman theme, which is one of my favorite new superhero themes kick in. It's a very simple theme. It almost feels like the Imperial March in a slow piano kind of way. It's awesome though. It's really, really awesome. And I think that that's great. One of the other things I noticed in this little prologue as well is the political undertones, which I think is really great. Now, not to get too into politics necessarily, but I just want to talk about the things that they were touching upon that I think are really cool. Is that, look, you have this scenario in which the city is flooding, and so then what happens? Well, they talk about it in this news broadcast that there's going to be chaos in the city, right? There, the city, which I think was already in a state of unrest when we found it in the Batman, is now really severely in a state of unrest. And then obviously the crime families with the death of Carmine Falcone, which I guess it's Falcone. Everyone is saying Falcone. I've always said Carmine Falcone, which I think Nolan's Batman universe said Falcone. I could be totally wrong, but we're going to use what they said, It's not Namor, it's Namor in the MCU, so we're going to use whatever they say. So I'm going to say the Falcones. Carmine Falcone is dead, and the other really awesome thing that I thought they highlighted was showing the wealth disparity, the wealth gap, the inequality there, where you have the rich people being protected from the city, and that includes your Bruce Waynes of the world, I'm sure, but also, as we see later, the Falcones, people who are really living in these mansions and super rich, and it's in the first 5 minutes, I'm so on board because there's so much going on that makes this feel like a three-dimensional, grounded, gritty crime drama that I love that about the opening of this show. So then we get reintroduced to Oz Cobb, and I love the walk. Look, there's not a lot in this show that's sort of meant to be corny or not corny, but just kind of a sly hint and a nod to things. But this walk very clearly is their attempt to be like, this is about as far into the comic booky as we're going to go with Oswald Cobblepot. And I think it's really fun. I think it's a really nice nod to the character as the Penguin here. So then, we have this conversation with Penguin and Alberto Falcone. And right away, I don't know if you guys caught this as well, but right away, my spider sense was tingling to borrow a phrase from another universe. I immediately knew, I think a couple things here, right? From the trailers, we knew that Sofia Falcone was going to be the biggest presence in the show from the Falcone family. And so I kind of thought, okay, you're introducing Alberto Falcone. I'm 90% sure that he's going to kill him. And sure enough, he kills him. But I think the conversation that they have is super interesting because, in hindsight now, having seen this hour-long episode, which, by the way, how great is it to have hour-long episodes that are just this awesome? Which I really enjoyed Agatha, the first 2 episodes, but if they were able to pace it out well, imagine what it would be like to have hour-long MCU episodes. Anyways, I digress. But, the conversation that they're having, I think is really interesting because in hindsight, it sets up everything about the show in the first 10 minutes. And you don't realize it at the time because you're just trying to soak it all in. The fact that, oh my gosh, he just killed, one of the Falcons. What's going to happen? And, sometimes shows open and they just kind of open with, they have slower burns, let's say. Like, not to go back to the MCU all the time, but, in WandaVision, right? The first couple episodes, there's slower burns, right? What happens in the first scene of WandaVision, it's not meant to be, the grand spark that sparks the entire show. But this is, right? He kills Alberto Falcone, and they have this conversation where it seems like a big drug drop is going to be happening that, the Penguin is now targeting to become the kingpin of Gotham City. So that's really interesting as well. And yeah, I mean, one of the other things that I really like here is that you get to see a bit more of Oz's personality and the fact that, look, I mean, Alberto is just making fun of Oz and really calling him a good soldier, which he really hates. And you get to see how much, disdain Penguin has for that kind of thing. I think that's a big part of his personality that we're going to see more of moving forward, which I think is a really, really good thing here. So yeah, anyways, I mentioned again in my notes here, I saw the death coming because, it's Sophia Falcone, and Oz kind of has this moment where he's like, like, what have I done? But I love that he's able to kind of pivot really quickly and move on from there. So then we have, Penguin, coming out of the lounge here with the body, and he scares off a bunch of kids who are trying to attack his car. Now, little did I know at the time, in the first 15 minutes of this episode, that this is also going to be really influential. That's one of the things I love about this opening, is that nothing feels wasted, right? The opening little prologue previously on kind of thing is setting up all the information that we need to know, and then we have all this information about him killing Alberto Falcone, and then him recruiting Victor Aguilar as well, which is a pivotal part, it seems like, of this show as well, which I think is really cool, because I think what it shows here is that Oz wants to be loved and respected. He told this story about a gangster that he knew as a child, who he admired so much, who he thought, was really respected. And that's really who he wants to be, because he's been so looked down upon. He's what I think is so interesting about this character so far is that he is basically a child. I mean, I think it's a point that the show makes to bring in his mother, because it shows that he is pretty much a child here. And yet at the same time, he's a deranged person all at once. He's crazy, he'll and that's part of his upbringing as well. It's kind of the whole nature and nurture kind of thing. But, I'm really interested now to see what this kid Victor is going to bring out of him and what their dynamic is going to be. Because that whole conversation they have in the car as they're driving off is so tense, and you can tell that Oz has this wicked in the sense of not necessarily evil, but just sort of sharp personality, and yet this also childish glee and this childish temper as well. And yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating to watch. That conversation in the car, before Victor really commits to all this, is just it's really one of the more tense scenes that I've seen in a long time. And Colin Farrell, again, kudos to him, is terrifying in the sense that he disappears into the role. He just completely disappears. You have that conversation between Oz and Victor in that parking lot where they're getting rid of the body, and it's great. It's so good because you can see that delicate balance between the two characters, and I think that is really awesome. So anyways, we get to meet now Sophia Falcone, as Oz is in some big trouble now, because Sophia immediately knows that I think she obviously knows that Oz is the one who killed her brother, although he gives her kind of a red herring at the end of the episode. And I have to say, Sophia Falcone got maybe about 15 minutes of screen time in this episode, and I am ready to say it, guys. I'm ready to say it. Sophia Falcone may be the single scariest villain in comic book movies and shows ever that I've seen personally. I think there's something different about having a character who is this cold and this calculating and this scary and also chaotic at the same time. But she knows exactly what she wants. It's just different than somebody like Heath Ledger's Joker, for example, who is scary. He's very scary, but he's scary in a sort of animalistic, chaotic way. Sophia Falcone is almost a predator, and I don't mean that in the legalistic sense. I just mean like an animal. Like she is going after what she wants, and she knows. She has her eyes on you. She doesn't really blink sometimes. it's crazy. Kudos. I think Kristen Miliotti or something like that. I apologize if I butchered the name, but she is just incredible in this first episode. I just could not believe it. She's so dangerous, and you see how Oz is playing such a dangerous game, lying to Sophia Falcone. And I think it's going to be this twisted web of twists and turns and zigs and zags, and it's incredibly tense, these scenes that they're in, because we're seeing the bigger picture of what Oz is doing, but it's hard for it's hard for us not to kind of root for him to get out of it, but then also it's just like bad people and then worse people, right? And that's what's really incredible about the show as well. So anyways, one of the things I talked about in last week's podcast episode, one of the things I wanted to see is a different side of Oz, and we definitely do get that here. We get that because we see him with his mom. Now, it's interesting because he seems like he cares about his mom, but then the show, as it does so deftly, spins it back on its head and shows that it's kind of an abusive relationship, and you see where his manic side kind of comes from, because his mom is just intense, and it's crazy. And that scene with his mom, I'm sure we'll see more of her as the season goes on, but really, really intense relationship, and we'll see how that plays into who he became. And then we're getting more of the dynamic between Victor and Oz, and I think that is working really well as well. I think it's a really unexpected thing that we got to see something like that, but I think it's going to bring out a lot from Oz as a character. Then he goes to the prison to meet Sal Maroni, who is played by the wonderful Clancy Brown. Really great scene, because you can tell that Oz, I don't know, on the one hand, it's almost like he's bluffing his way into things, but then on the other hand, he puts the ring on the table, and it's like, yeah, no, he had that whole thing figured out at the very end, because then we have this interesting, kind of intense car chase that goes on there, and Sophia captures him and is trying to get a confession out of him. Really, really uncomfortable scene, but in all the right ways, quote unquote, the right ways, the ways in which the directors and the writers intended it, for sure. And then the body of Alberto Falcone is found, and it looks like the whole plan, because I was a little confused. I was like, how does Oz just get out of this at the end of the episode? But then you realize that he is framing Maroni, and now we're basically starting a gang war. And it's just, look, this is not necessarily, as we wrap up my thoughts on this episode, this is not necessarily my quote-unquote kind of show. I mean, just as a reference, my 3 favorite shows of all time right now are Friends, number 1, number 2, The West Wing, and number 3, Stranger Things. So this is not necessarily my quote-unquote kind of show. I haven't seen The Sopranos, I haven't seen, I haven't really been a big big fan, I guess, of gangster shows and gangster movies, but I have to say that this show, while it's not going to be the one that warms my heart and does, but the actors, the performances are intense. The story is riveting. I'm a sucker for political intrigue in shows, and yeah, I mean, gang warfare in a certain sense is kind of like politics, right? It's really interesting in that way. And so all the subterfuge and all these different things that are going on, I'm just such a big fan of shows that are complex and treat their characters as really complicated people. And look, I don't know. I mean, like I said last week, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to relate to Oz more than just, oh, he's a bad guy, and that's who he is. And I think we're getting that. I think we're getting a true crime kind of feel. Not true crime, but, truly a crime kind of feel. And I am blown away. I'm blown away by this first episode. I cannot wait for the next one. I can't wait to see where we go from here. And I love getting to spend an hour every week in this Batman universe. I love it. I love that we're getting to do that. And I think that that's awesome. So let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this first episode of The Penguin. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Let me know in the comments down below. And guys, that'll do it for Access Blockbusters Pod episode number 41. Thank you guys so much for joining us on today's episode. And it's been a joy to be able to talk about all these things. Like I said, for a couple more weeks, we're going to have 3 episodes of television coming out pretty much every single week, which is awesome. And then it's going to be Agatha and Penguin for a little bit. So it's a fun time, guys. It's really a fun time. I'm going to be seeing some movies in the coming weeks as well. We're going to be talking about Joker Folie à Deux, which is coming out in a couple weeks, and then I'm hoping to see movies like Transformers 1, Wild Robot. Who knows if we'll do reviews about that? Probably. I'll try to do that in the coming weeks as well. maybe even Saturday night, which is a movie that's coming out in a few weeks. But yeah, I mean, stay tuned on the channel. It's going to be an exciting time. But until then, guys, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Give this video a like if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel. Rate it on Spotify. And I will see you guys in the next one.